This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. Life can be very difficult at times. As listeners of this podcast, you may know that life's problems can often feel insurmountable, and it's not uncommon to feel alone and at odds with yourself. However, you don't have to handle life's twists and turns alone. BetterHelp Online Therapy is there for you. They will assess your needs and recommend a licensed professional therapist specializing in your specific care needs within 48 hours. I live in New York City, which is the epicenter of therapy, and I've seen it work wonders for many of my friends and colleagues. But even in a big city, it can be difficult to get an appointment with a therapist, sometimes taking weeks or even months. BetterHelp is always accessible. You're never left with outrageous waiting periods. If your therapist isn't the right fit, you can easily switch. BetterHelp is not a crisis hotline. It's not self-help. It's professional online therapy that is secure and available worldwide. BetterHelp is a great way to invest in yourself, and they have a special offer for my listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/Nick Bryant. That's betterhelp.com/Nick Bryant.
The paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Ashley Conway. He's a psychologist in the UK who works with victims that have been highly traumatized. He is the chair for the Clinic for Dissociative Studies, and he is the editor of a book called Trauma and Memory, The Science and the Silenced. How are you doing today, Ashley?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Nick. It's really nice to see you.
Good to see you. So the science and the silenced. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm very proud of that title. That was me. That took me ages to come up with it. So it was a book. It is a book about trauma and memory, but it's actually about the nonsense. The non-science, I quite like muddling those two words, of the false memory groups. So the kind of subheading, the science and the silenced. The science completely contradicts almost everything that the false memory people say. And the silenced is the effect of it. They silence a lot of voices, a lot of people who've already been victimized. And I wanted to draw attention to that. And that's what the book does, actually. So it's about both those things. It talks about the real science, and it talks about the effect of people being silenced.
The False Memory Syndrome Foundation started in the United States of America, for my listeners who aren't familiar with it. And it's a completely dubious organization, but it gained tremendous power. And it said that therapists implanting memories of false abuse was an endemic part of our society, that it was actually pandemic. And the founders were very dubious. The people that founded it, Pamela Fried and Peter Fried, they were both academics. And actually, they were brothers and sisters, too. They were married, but they were stepbrother and stepsister. And then Ralph Underwager was one of the founders, too. And he's a theologian who said that pedophilia is God's will, and that 70% of girls that were molested as minors found the experience beneficial. So that is the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And it was given a tremendous boost by people in the media. Frontline was laudatory towards the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, as was a New Yorker article. And do you see that type of propaganda in the UK?
Yeah, 100%, Nick. And interestingly, we had a very, very parallel story in the setting up of the British False Memory Group, where it was set up by a father accused by two of his daughters of abuse. So it was a lot of the story in the setup was similar, and the press absolutely lapped it up. So he was good with the press. He would go to the kind of popular press with the story. And the story always was pretty much the same from any of the things they put out. We were a great, happy family. Everything was okay until usually it would be a young adult daughter, went to a therapist, is the usual line. And then after that, she started accusing me of abuse, and it's obviously nonsense. So all this nonsense was put in her head by the therapist. That would be the line that they would take. And actually, can I just say something more about that, Nick, about why I thought that was I think one of the things for the press was it's kind of a good story is to be falsely accused, especially if you end up in court. And the massive problem that we've had as clinicians, as people trying to work with people who've been victimized, is that actually the truth, them telling their story, becomes litigious because you're making an allegation of a criminal offense. So the newspapers would generally not take those stories. I mean, I don't know whether or not they believed them, but so what naturally happened was there was a kind of immediate bias to stories of people who saying they'd been falsely accused of something. And so the whole other half of that, I didn't even know if you could call it another half, the whole other piece of that story was completely ignored by the press.
And the gentleman who founded the British adjunct of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, could you tell us a little bit about him and what he said about his daughters?
Yeah, I actually had two quite long telephone conversations with him right at the beginning. When the British organization started up, and I was then working in therapy and occasionally with people who'd report abuse, I was genuinely interested in the idea that people might make false allegations, or that a therapist might deliberately or accidentally kind of mislead somebody into believing something. And sorry, Nick, somebody started a machine just outside my window. Yeah, so I was genuinely interested in that as an idea that could happen. I hadn't come across it, but I thought I'd call him up and talk about it, which I did. And I found the conversations very strange. We had one, and then which was probably about an hour on the telephone, and then agreed to have another. And in the second one, I decided to ask him how he accounted for his daughter's accusations. In the first one, he said that one of them had been to see a homeopath with some minor symptoms, and he said that the homeopath said to her, "You have symptoms typical of somebody who's been abused in childhood." And his explanation was she out of that comment, she created an entire kind of catalogue, a library of memories of abuse by him, which sounded kind of unlikely to me, to say the least. And then I think he told me that in the first conversation. And in the second one, I said, "Okay, how do you account for the second daughter accusing you?" And this is going to sound unbelievable. I mean, it was unbelievable to me, but it's what he said. He said, "Well, she caught it off the first one. She caught false memory syndrome off the first one." And I said jokingly, "What, like measles?" And he said, "Yeah, like measles." And that was when I thought, I don't think there's any point in having any further conversation with him. It was so kind of bizarre that was where my contact with him ended. And then I found myself working with clients who were talking about their distress about things they were reading about false memory, and where there were allegations that things they were reporting might be false. And I think I was early on realizing the damage that this could do to people who've already been traumatized by child sexual abuse.
Well, that kind of nonsense was very predominant in the United States. And I forgot to mention that Peter Fried molested his daughter, and she didn't tell anyone about it, but it was the mother, that Pamela Fried, that made a big deal out of it. And actually, Jennifer Fried was teaching at a university, and she tried to get her daughter fired because her husband, she said that her husband would never molest the daughter. And this is in Pennsylvania. And then there's a weekly in Philadelphia who interviewed Peter Fried and asked him, how can he prove that he didn't molest his daughter? Yeah. And he said, because the dog didn't bark. That was his excuse. I mean, that's right up there with measles.
Measles, yeah.
It's but it's amazing how much power that these organizations have.
It is. And I'm still not sure, Nick, how that happened. That they're kind of, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic, the PR machine was incredibly effective. And I think, I mean, I'm not 100% sure about how that happened, but I think, I mean, I'm trying to stand back as a psychologist from that. And I think there may have been at the time when, I think if we put it in its historical context, it started in the US in the early 90s, I think, here probably the mid 90s. And there was probably still a great unwillingness to believe in how widespread the abuse of children was. And I think that's my way of understanding it, actually, is that people, the kind of ordinary people, would rather believe it was I can't remember what they called it now. It was like a sort of plague of accusations, was explicable in terms of they'd rather believe it was down to crazy therapists than actually because that's what was the truth. And I think what kind of breaks that line very strongly, and it's interesting in that kind of history and looking back at the dates, is the arrival of the internet. And we found out there were so many people with an interest in imagery of child abuse, and that it became impossible to realistically say this was a very minority interest.
I think that the smartphone has probably created a bigger appetite for child pornography, because before, people had to take risks. They had to join groups. They had to get stuff through the mail, pornography through the mail. But now they just have to open up their smartphone.
Yeah.
And so I would surmise that smartphones have created a bigger demand for child pornography. And the book, The Silence in the Silenced, what is the main point that you try to get across with that book?
I think it's quite a few different points, actually. I think that I wrote a couple of chapters for it, and I'll tell you I'll tell you about my two because they're examples, but there are one or two people looked at very specific things, like there's a chapter on Loftus's Lost in the Mall study and the evolution of the data over time, suggesting it's not being entirely transparent where that data came from. There's been a reanalysis of Julia Shaw, who's a psychologist, an academic psychologist here, who's a false memory advocate. and a reanalysis of her data. So some of it's kind of quite hot. That's where the science part comes in, quite hardcore kind of reanalysis of data and tracking it back through histories, where it's come from. My two parts were, one was an interview with Ross Chait, who you may know of, who I think has done, he wrote an amazing book called The Witch Hunt Narrative. And he's got an extraordinary website where he logs people who've recovered memories which have been demonstrated to be accurate after the FMS lines say that they're nonsense. I really liked that. Ross's story is so extraordinary that it kind of, I think it draws you in. I like the human stories. And then the other thing that I did was to write about how my perception had changed over 25 years, because I'd done the chapter from the person I co-edited with, Valerie Sinison, had edited a book 25 years earlier, in which I contributed a chapter, and she asked me to kind of update it. And when I reread it, I thought, actually, I think it's not bad. But then I wrote about what I thought was wrong with it, which is it was naive. And I think it was kind of well-intentioned. I think it was pretty accurate. And it was naive. And my naivety was thinking these people are interested in the truth, or they're interested in the science, and they're interested in the evidence. And now I don't think they're remotely interested in that. They have an agenda. They're a pressure group. They have an agenda, and that's what they want to pursue. It's nothing to do. That's why the science part was in the title, because they often claim the science, but actually, when you look at it, it's not there.
I think that the Center on Disease Control has put out a number that's pretty substantial, that 25%, and some people would say that this is an underestimate. Some people would say that it's an overestimate, but yeah. CDC has concluded that came out with a number that 25% of women have been abused as minors. And when you extrapolate that to American society, that's millions.
Yeah, it is. It's millions and millions and millions of people. And the consequences upon both their mental health and actually physical health. I mean, there's evidence that people with histories of abuse have more illnesses in adult life. And that the consequences are just unimaginable. The scale of it is so huge.
If there's one thing that you could take out of society to make it so much better, if you could take that one element out, child sexual abuse,
yeah,
you'd be able to empty the prisons, you'd be able to empty the psychiatric hospitals. Yeah. It would be quite amazing.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Nick. And it's one that's, so I think, still underestimated, the kind of overall cost to society. And I think the point about prisons is true as well. I think I don't know I can't remember the specific data on it, but it's a significant proportion of the prison population will be people who've been abused.
So false memories can be either positive or negative. Could you discuss the differentiation there?
Yeah, sure. I'm pleased to ask that one, Nick, because it's one of my favorites. Yeah, so because the False Memory Society only talk about the bits that they like to talk about. So memories, if there is such a thing, if we accept there's such a thing as false memory, you could have two types. So you could have a false memory that's something that I would call a false positive memory. You remember something happening that didn't actually happen, that did not happen. So that would be what I would call a false positive memory. But the other kind of memory that you can have that would be false is a false negative memory. So you could believe that something did not happen that did actually happen. Okay, so the false memory societies really only talk about false positive memories. So they will talk about that a lot. There is a vast amount of evidence, that certainly the UK branch denies, but it's ridiculous to deny, of trauma, of the reality of traumatic amnesia, that people forget things when they've had very traumatic experiences. And it's interesting, if you talk about that with military personnel, people don't seem to get very upset. If you say that this person had this terrible thing happen and they don't remember some of it, they kind of go, yeah, they'll be quite sympathetic. If you say this kid had this happen to them over a period of years and it was blanked out and now they remember it, they suddenly become questioned and told they've got false memories. And so there's an interesting thing there. So they don't acknowledge the reality of a false negative memory, that people can blank things out. It's also one of the reasons why I started the book with the interview with Ross Chait, because he gives such a brilliant first-hand account of not remembering something and then remembering it, and saying almost, I think he does say maybe literally from one day to the next, he would say, I did not believe this thing happened on one day, and the next day I was certain it did. And he's a very credible man. And so that's one thing. I think they focus on one kind of false memory only and want to pretend the other one doesn't exist. And the other thing that I think is quite interesting is I don't think I can ever remember them mentioning the idea that an accused person might be the one having the false memory. So why not? It seems like a lot of abuse might take place when somebody's inebriated. It might very well be it might be a genuine false memory. They might not remember doing it, but that's never discussed by them. Why aren't we talking about false memory of being innocent? Nobody talks about that, or they certainly don't. And I think that's an interesting thing. And I think there's some evidence that abusers dissociate when they're abusing, and they genuinely might have problems remembering having done it. But you won't get the false memory. Society's talking about that.
In case my listeners don't know, Ross Chait is a professor at Brown University who had a recovered memory of sexual abuse in his adulthood. And he spent 15 years writing a book called The Witch Hunt Narrative, where he went over all the cases in the 80s and 90s, or a number of them, that were just kind of written off as satanic panic and said no one got abused. And he pretty much showed that in most of those cases, there was child sexual abuse, even though the mainstream media had kind of written it off. And with Ross's book, would you like to talk a little bit about that? It's a very powerful book. The Witch Hunt.
I think it's an extraordinary book, and you can tell it kind of feels like it took him 15 years. I don't know whether you thought that. I haven't read it. I read it when it came out, and I haven't read it since. But my memory of it is that it actually again links somebody meticulously going through, getting the evidence, presenting it, and still somehow, I think recently his book's been criticized in something. I saw something where people are saying, oh, well, it's not true. And he's like, the evidence seemed to me to be really very convincing, and he's got such a good mind. And there's still that part of the population who will stick with their belief that they'll find a reason to discount that, and that I think he did an amazing job, and I think that the evidence that he accumulated has had a very positive effect. And I suppose that's my summary. And there will still be people who say that's not enough, or that can't be true, or they'll find some reason to discount it. And I think that's kind of interesting. Is there any amount of evidence that you could have? And I think the answer is probably no. To reconsider their view.
Well, as you said, the false memory people aren't really following science. They're following their agenda. And there are 4 pillars of false memory syndrome theory. Could you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So the first one I said something about, which is that the first one would be there's no such thing as traumatic amnesia. That's clearly just wrong. So the 4 things I'm going to say are there's good science behind what I'm going to say. That's just wrong. There's so much evidence to show that when people are traumatized in lots of different settings, it's not just to do with sexual abuse. As I said, that for example, in military, I worked a lot of my early career, what I learned a lot about trauma was with people where there'd been working in places where there are armed robberies, where there may have been violence during the course of the robbery. And it was just completely normal for them to have. That's what I learned, was having patches where they'd say, I don't remember what happened between this bit and this bit, was just very common. It was just like almost like an everyday thing when I listened to them. So that idea that traumatic amnesia doesn't happen, that's the first one I'd say that they rely on, is just wrong. It's just nonsense. So the second pillar is that recall is triggered by therapy. And most of the time, that's not true. Most of the time, triggers to recall of abuse do not occur during therapy. They occur outside of therapy. So it can be things like something seen on TV, something in the media. It could be something somebody's seen or heard, or somebody's talking to them. And that it may be that leads them into therapy. It may be they start then talking about it in therapy. And that, I think if I were to be kind, I might say that might be why the experience of some of those people is you didn't start talking about this until you went into therapy. Well, that doesn't mean that the therapy caused you to start talking about this. It doesn't mean that at all to me. I've worked with I don't know how many hundreds of people who've been abused, and I think it's very they will typically arrive with either a complete memory or a fragmentary memory, or a feeling that something was wrong, and then they start talking about it, and that's what happens. People, and the evidence is there's very strong evidence that the recall does not occur during therapy. Typically, it starts somewhere else first. Then the other part, so the third part of the story is that delayed recall is less reliable than continual recall. That's just wrong as well. There's lots of evidence to show that they're pretty comparable, which maybe is surprising, but they are. And yeah, the fourth one, which I think is a really big one and is suckered a lot of people, including mental health professionals and media and lawyers, which is that somehow that laboratory studies teach us about real life trauma. And of course, ethically, you can't create trauma in a laboratory. You just can't do that. So you do something rather trivial, like if you can persuade somebody they might have got lost in a shopping mall, and okay, you could do that as a piece of research, but what does it tell us about adults who were abused in childhood? I think it tells us literally nothing. I think it's a complete irrelevance. And the idea that there's some equivalence in that, and there's something in that to teach us about abuse, I think is just completely misleading. So those would be what I think are the kind of four pillars. And when you take them away, there's nothing really left. Like they're just, and none of them are supported by the science.
It's a house of cards.
Yeah, indeed.
The dissociative amnesia is in fact, a psychiatric condition that's in the DSM-5, which is the Bible of psychiatric diagnoses. And false memory syndrome is not in the DSM-5, nor will it ever be in the DSM-5. So it's amazing that we even have this tug of war going on in the first place.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with you, absolutely. And I think it really is an interesting question to how it's been kind of adopted by the professional societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Both in the US and over here.
Could you talk a little bit about policy capture?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I certainly know much more about how that's happened or what has happened in the UK. I suspect something similar has happened in the US. I know that I've been, and maybe we can talk about that more if you want to, but in the US, I remember when I first came across the board of the FMSF, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, I was surprised by how many apparently respectable people were on that board and wondered why they would be on it. In the UK, The British Psychological Society, I think that in terms of policy capture, we had a situation where our most recent, which is shamefully a document written in 2008, is our most recent policy document on the memory and law, I think it was called. The person who chaired it was also, I've got to remember this because there were so many multiple roles, was a trustee, which means like a kind of board member. I think it's like an equivalent in American non-profit of being like a board member of the British Psychological Society. He held a senior post in the society as chair of a board. He selected himself as the chair of the committee that would write the report on memory. And he was a false memory sympathizer who later formally became a board member of the British False Memory Society. And what we've seen in the British side is that the false memory line has been kind of swallowed hook, line, and sinker by the professional societies, and I think that's something quite shameful, that they've either not had the courage or not had the wit to kind of look at it closely and say this is just not right, and we as a professional society should be speaking up loudly against this nonsense. And so far, and I'm talking about like 25 years, nearly 25 years, they've failed miserably to do that.
And do you believe, I mean, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation in America had a media juggernaut. And
yeah.
How could the American Psychology Association, how could they have interacted with that? Or how could people, professional societies in the UK interact with that type of juggernaut?
Well, I think that's a really good question, Nick, and I think it's a very big question as to why they haven't. In the US, the honest answer is I don't know. I think that I don't want to say this about the US one because I don't know enough about them. I think in the UK it's a kind of it's worse than laziness, because what I'd say is it's worse than useless. I mean, saying nothing would be useless, but actually producing documents which kind of support the FMS line, or at least don't confront it, I think is worse. And I think that it's an interesting question why, and it may be the truth is complicated, and what people want to believe is complicated, and I don't think they want to get into that. I think that the policy captures when you get a few people with loud voices who are very pushy taking control, and they actually take control of what becomes the professional society's kind of stated position on something, and I think it's terrible.
Well, with the psychology, I mean, you've got science on your side, and with false memory syndrome, they really have but dogma and no real scientific foundations. But yet they seem to have had such a loud voice. And actually, I think that they influenced how psychology and psychiatry was conducted in the United States, where psychologists and psychiatrists might have been tentative to say certain things to patients because of the dogma that had been generated by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely. I agree with that absolutely, Nick. And I think it's, again, it's one of the harmful things. I think it's a bit less so now, but that therapists would be frightened, literally frightened, of working with somebody who said they've recovered memories of abuse, and they'd be thinking, should I believe this? Should I be encouraging it? Should I be? And it inhibited them from doing their normal therapeutic work completely. There was a great deal of fear. Yeah, but there was a time when really therapists were frightened. And I think actually you had it even worse in the US. I think you had people picketing therapists and like picketing their offices and giving them a whole load of aggravation. The therapists who were being more outspoken about therapy, about helping people who'd been abused in childhood.
Well, here, as I said earlier, the media was seduced by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Yeah.
You had people like Martin Orne.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about Martin Orne?
Yeah, I'll talk about a bit about Martin Orne. Wow. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about him. Okay, and I'm very aware when I say this that it's even to myself, it can sound like conspiracy theory, but Martin Orne is an important, wasn't it? He's now deceased. He was an important man. He was highly regarded as a psychiatrist. He was involved quite deeply with the CIA MK Ultra program, a mind control program. And he was specifically, this is stated under sworn testimony, and there are records of that, specifically identified as being involved in a program which involved abuse of children. And Martin Orne, as I understand it, believed that he could induce amnesia in children who were being abused. And at that time, that was something that the CIA, this is Cold War and just after that, were very interested in all this stuff about, can you get somebody to do something that they might not otherwise do? Can you get them to not recall it? All of that was really interesting to them. And Martin Orne was deeply into it, and was deeply into it with a connection with child abuse. When the False Memory Syndrome Foundation initial group got together, they were, as you said, I think earlier on, they were a bunch of people who didn't look very credible, and they'd been they were accused of having an unhealthy interest in children themselves. Yes. And they needed a kind of respectability. And very early on, they linked up with Martin Orne, the man who'd come out of the CIA Ultra program and had a kind of specialty in inducing amnesia. And he believed that he could do that. So he also believed, and this was his downfall, or I don't know if it really was, but it was where things started going wrong. He believed he could induce amnesia. Now, what happened was some of the now young women, 10 or even 20 years later, started talking about what was done to them in the MK Ultra program. So Martin Orne and the False Memory Syndrome Foundation had a very common goal, which was to discredit people saying this thing was done to me 20 years ago by this person. They both needed to find a way out of that and to discredit it and to get people to disbelieve it. So Martin Orne was really one of their very first recruits on their board. He had the respectability, I think, and his job was to recruit other respectable people onto the board, which he seemed to do very successfully. And I think that was tactically a very clever move. But it was, I called it in my notes when I was writing about it, a marriage made in hell. The kind of the CIA mind controller and the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and it is. It's just like they just fit together perfectly. They've got exactly the same goals: how to make good or honest, ordinary people disbelieve somebody when they say this was done to me 20 years ago. They have exactly the same goal.
As a therapist, do you see, are there patients that come to you and because of the propaganda that's been laid down by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, the British side of it?
Yeah, I've had
a war of whether or not this happened, whether or not they were abused, and they just don't know.
Well, I've had in a way, I'm not sure I'll answer that question directly, Nick, but I'll tell you something else about it, which I found affected me profoundly, actually, and affected me profoundly in a way that made me kind of decide I would never give up this campaign for the truth, actually, about them. And that was, I saw this smart young woman who said to me, I understand I was abused by a man over a period of time. I understand there are bad people in the world. The thing I really, really don't understand and really upsets me is that so many people fall for this shit, this bullshit. And she talked, and she was really, really distressed about that. It wasn't, and I think I got it. I think she was a mentally healthy person. She understood, yes, there are bad people in the world, and I was unfortunate enough to be a victim of one of them. I don't understand. And literally, she meant it very really, and she would say this, spending sessions crying about it and crying and crying. How does anybody believe this stuff? How can they? Why would they take the word of these people? That distressed her. We spent at least as much time talking about her distress about that as we did about what happened to her. And I think I get it. There seems a kind of madness to it. And it's like, why would anybody believe it?
It's there's a lot. It had a lot of traction, and DARVO.
Yeah.
And reverse victim and offender. Could you tell us about that? That's a very efficacious strategy.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I think it's a brilliant acronym. Yeah, so that was a term invented by Jennifer Freyd, whose parents set up the American False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And so DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. And she used that to sum up the typical response of an abuser to an accusation. So you deny, you make an accusation about them, they're drug addicts, or there's something wrong with them, or whatever, they're mentally unwell. And they reverse victim and offender. So they quickly go to, how can you say this about me? Why are you doing it? It's just really painful for me. So they'll talk about themselves. They'll switch it to being themselves as the victim in one or two sentences. And I think that the false memory groups are kind of institutionally DARVO. That's what they do as organizations. They deny reality. They make themselves the victims. They kind of imply that at best, these people who are making accusations don't even know what their real memories are. And they just say this stuff because they're so vulnerable. They get ideas put in their head and then they fly away with them. So it's always, there's something wrong with them, and somebody's bad. So it's been historically the therapist, which is also, I think, tactically quite a clever move. You don't say they're bad. You say it's these wicked therapists who put these ideas in their head, who have this kind of agenda of, we want to convince the world that there's millions of people get abused. Actually, well, they do. It's like we don't have an agenda of wanting to promote that. We have an agenda of wanting to probably to promote the truth, but yeah.
Not too many people get into psychology to get rich. There's a few, but
yeah, I don't think many of them. I don't think many of them working with victims of abuse get rich. Yeah. I think that the people who get rich are the FMS advocates acting as expert witnesses. I mean, certainly Elizabeth Loftus would be one.
So, how will our society, the tentacles of false memories, the false memory syndrome, it's so ubiquitous in our society. How are we going to transcend that? It's going to take time. I mean, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation went down 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
But the damage is still done.
Yeah, it is still done. I think I think it's going to be a slow process. I think it is happening, Nick. I think that we've had now the kind of unpleasant series of like celebrities who've been disclosed to be abusers, where there's just been no real data. I said, like in the US, you've had Bill Cosby, and we've had Weinstein, and we've had people where actually, I think the media actually is coming to realize this is real. In the UK, we had Jimmy Savile, who was a huge celebrity, and it only emerged after his death. And the inquiries after his death were just awful, that revealed he was abusing kids for, I think, his whole adult life, and was a very big TV celebrity. And actually, dozens and dozens of people must have known and said nothing. And I think now, interestingly, I think the tide will turn because of the kind of general public, rather than, which I think is a shameful thing. I think that the kind of mental health insiders should be leading this. Instead, they're kind of following it. But I think people are now realizing, and we've also in the UK had a massive, the biggest ever, I think it's the biggest ever public inquiry of anything, but interviewing adults who report having been abused as children. They had a specific brief, which was in institutional care, so either in children's homes or by institutions. So it might have been in schools, it might have been in churches or religious organizations. And it's just the kind of volume and the intensity of it, I think, has surprised even those of us who kind of thought we knew how bad it was. It's just the more you look, the more you see, I think.
Well, the UK, it sounded like that commission was going to get to the bottom of a lot of things, but
yeah, I think it's
politics.
Yeah, I think I don't know enough about what's going to happen next, but what it seems to me to have done is accumulate a massive amount of data. I mean, that's really not, it's very, very hard to question. And when I've talked to some of the people who were quite deeply involved with that, who said, and some of those people, I think it was hard for them, the people working on it, they were giving people space to talk about what had happened to them and listening to them day after day after day. And, they were getting people who were 70, 80 years old saying, I've never disclosed this before. And I think they were shocked. Even the people who were on the inside were shocked by the level, by the extremity. And I think, and it's my hope, that that's going to change. And it is gradual. I think it's gradual, and rather than sudden. And actually, one other thing I'd say, Nick, because I think that the media, things like films like Spotlight, I think did a good job. They did something important. And I think there'll be more of those to come. And I think getting something out but again, to me, it seems pretty sad that it has to be, the change is coming kind of bottom up rather than the other way around in terms of mental health awareness. It's coming from ordinary people just saying this is not okay. And they're wanting something to change. I think it'll come from them.
Well, as I said earlier, according to the Centers on Disease Control, 25%.
Yeah.
I mean, that's millions of.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely millions. Yeah.
And obviously, they are not getting help, or a lot of them are not getting help for this.
No.
They're just probably keeping it amongst themselves, which it makes it far more deleterious.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that in itself is also a huge issue, that we've got now a diagnosis of complex PTSD, and that carries with it implications, because when you're treating that, you have to acknowledge that's going to take a lot of work. These people need a lot of therapy, and it's a huge demand on resources. It's a big thing to acknowledge, and the implications of it are big. But we've got to do it.
Well, Ashley, I want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast. Is there any closing comments that you'd like to make about what we've been discussing?
I think what I'd like to say, because it's quite easy to get depressed by all this, I think there are also some. I think there are some really good, amazing people out there pushing the truth and speaking for the truth, and I think that's really important. There are good people out there trying to do good things, and I think that's still going on. And I think it's a kind of it's multidisciplinary, and it's going on in different countries. So you've got criminologists, and you've got psychologists, and you've got sociologists. You've got different people who are prepared to confront this. Yeah.
It's going to take a lot of people getting on the same page.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
And somehow our society is going to have to make it all right for people to come forward and say, I was sexually abused and I need help.
Well, that's a good point, Nick. And we've had more of that. And I think you have too. Like, we've had things like a couple of professional footballers who would seem, or now retired, but who would be kind of seen as kind of macho figures and males that people look up to, saying they were abused as kids. And I think that's brilliant, actually, that kind of thing where, and I think actually the other thing that I thought was stunning watching from here was the Larry Nassar having at his hearing, I think it was his sentencing hearing, where the girls got an opportunity, or the young women as they are now, got an opportunity to say something. I found that immensely powerful. I suppose that comes down to human stories, doesn't it, Nick? That's the power of a human saying, this is what you did to me.
And at the same time, we have Jeffrey Epstein and all those victims and completely covered up. So,
completely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's still a long way to go.
It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Thank you so much, Ash, and have yourself a wonderful night.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much. It was really nice talking to you.